Sails torn, beaten and broken, the SS Pompadellus sought refuge on an exotic, unexplored island. With the crew working to unload their rum, the doughy-faced captain spent much time apart, staring at the distant native girls through his telescope. There was a reason they would later call him Alhanzi. Hatching a nefarious plan, Alhanzi and his crew of drunken Spanish sex offenders set about making a cage for the natives, a cage he would later christen El Dormitorio del Diablo. The tales they later told around the campfires at night were ones the ship's scribe could never ink onto his parchment. These were not tales for cultured European ears. These should never be known beyond those that partook in them. Yes, my fellow survivalists, welcome to Survival Fountain of Youth. Honestly, if all games started with storylines like that, socially starved gamers like myself would flock to them. Anyway, let's get you up to speed on why you're on this island with a vastly improved intro cinematics. Key to music. I'm not here to give you tips and hints in this game, but I will say that when you first start, do not drink this living water. Save it till much later, after at least 4 deaths. Yes, you heard me right, because very strangely the game leads you to this very quickly, where not understanding its importance, you'll probably consume it after you get hurt a little bit, but it is in fact the most precious and rare commodity in the game. Look, if you give a young lad a chocolate milkshake, what do you think he will do when he gets thirsty later on? Yeah, I don't think that was the greatest game design, but let's move on. First off, the trailer as it plays here is pretty cool and does show a lot to do. In fact, it looks pretty action-packed, doesn't it? Yeah, nah. And that's actually a term that you do hear in New Zealand quite a lot. I think New Zealanders don't like to offend people, so it's a polite way of letting people down gently. It's like you are considering agreeing with them, but at the very last moment you change your mind. So why then, Maddie, does Fountain of Youth have such great reviews if it isn't like the trailer? Okay, it does have great reviews, but don't judge me too early as I've not actually said what I think of the game yet. The reviews do clearly show that people enjoy a lot about the game, but there are hints in some of those reviews that all is not quite as it seems. My little suspicion antennae are twitching a bit here. And that is because in a lot of those reviews there is reference to the game being a bit slow. But let's see what the data tells us, as data can't be misinterpreted and presented how you want it to be. Nope, that's never happened in the history of the planet. But let me set the scene first. You start off on the main island and you will eventually build a ship and sail to another island. The building of the ship is the first key milestone of the game. And I'd expect most people to get to this in about 20 to 30 hours of gameplay, but only 30% of players have achieved the Steam achievement. Then, if you look at the Steam charts, you can see that player numbers are low now after the initial surge when it got picked up by a lot of YouTubers and streamers last year. And more worrying, there is another Steam achievement that I would have thought most players would get with 15 to 20 hours of play, give or take, and only 37% have got this. The vast majority of players are simply just not staying with the game. Look, don't blame me, I'm just pointing out pretty obvious things here. So what are some of my quick thoughts on the game? The story of the game is a lot bigger than most people think. It is pretty cliche, but there is a lot to it, and there is a lot to explore. There's a fair amount of crafting and recipes and similar such things. It isn't bad, and I don't think that at all. It isn't bad at all. The graphics are nice, the sound's okay. The combat is simplistic but functional. The world feels alive. Hang on a sec. Don't say shit you don't mean, Maddie. Move that from a statement into a question. So let's ask, is the world alive around you? Is it immersive? And honestly, not really. For me, this was a problem as the world is split into highly defined spawn and resource locations. For example, you will always find a boar or coyotes in a certain area. And when you do map the terrain, every resource is clearly marked. It feels way too structured to feel alive, but strangely the game has to be like this, as it is so reliant on resource gathering, and I really mean that. so knowing where every single resource is in fact critical. And this was where I really struggled to put what I felt about this game into words. It is just too cumbersome to get almost anything done. You always get dragged repeatedly into trivial foraging and crafting. Now, you could argue and say, well, that's realistic, isn't it? And I guess it is a little, but after 30 or so hours, you really tire of it. There is a thing in gaming, in particular in survival games, called quality of life mechanic. It is the recognition that players want to advance and not get stuck in an endless grind, so the game helps them progress in a balanced way. It's one of the tougher things for devs to work out, but that all just felt lacking here. I'd describe my quality of life in this game as pretty poor. At times I felt I had to suck my gut in and stick with the game to get this video done, as my quality of life simply packed its bags and ran off down the beach. Survival Fountain of Youth feels pretty hard at times, and particularly the start where thirst and hunger are a constant problem, but once you figure that out it becomes pretty predictable. There is a lot to do, but for me that all felt somewhat shallow. But I do remind you I kind of enjoyed playing the game for the most part, so don't take these all as big negatives. Importantly, however, I never got that wow moment, that holy shit moment. Even when I got to the new lands, to the new islands, it felt like I'd already explored them, even though I hadn't, if you get my drift. If you don't, then that's fine, because half the time I don't really know what I'm saying either. Despite there being several horizons in the game, they held no wonders, well, not really for me anyway. A game should aim to tap into our emotions, to create a moment that you will take away and say things like, I remember when I first tamed my first T-Rex, or I remember cowering inside my house terrified of all those sounds outside. Whatever really, it doesn't really matter. And on reflection, this game has created no such memories like that for me. Yeah, the Steam reviews are very positive and I'm super pleased for the developers for that, but sometimes all is not what it seems. For me, Survival Fountain of Youth was like walking around a garden with your grandma. There's nothing wrong with that at all, but you don't want to do it too often. Thanks for watching. See you in the next chapter.